Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I have the pleasure to introduce Ziyanda Stuurman for our talk today. She's speaking about her book, Can We Be Safe? An investigation into the South African police services. Ziyanda graduated from the University of Stellenbosch with political science and international relations, and has been then since then to the UK and the United States on bursaries, and has advanced degrees in conflict security and development studies from the Sussex University and international development from the Brandeis University in the United States. Ziyanda now works at UCT as a project manager. I'm handing over now to Ziyanda to talk about her book.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hans. And thank you to everybody who is in the hall and who is watching today. Very excited to chat to you. Let me get started. And I'm going to start my contribution to the conversation today with a very necessary disclaimer. And that's that for the next few minutes, I'm going to throw quite a few numbers at you, and you may want to jot some of these numbers down or focus on a few. But often I found in conversations with people and in the process of writing my book, Can We Be Safe? The Future of Policing in South Africa, as well as in many panel discussions that I've been part of, I've realized that people who don't research the police and the practice of policing and the ways in which that institution shapes our society sometimes don't grasp how spectacular the problems are and just how urgent many of the issues within our policing system have become. So I'm going to start by doing that today, and then I think that would be a really good foundation for a broader conversation, both about the institution, but also about the practice of policing. So when we talk about the police service, I think there's some basic numbers that help us understand both its size and its mandate. So as of November 2020, the police employed 187,358 people, and roughly 160,000 of whom are police officers. These are officers who are split between commissioned and non-commissioned officers. The difference between them being that commissioned officers are in police leadership. So according to the medium-term budget speech that was tabled in Parliament by Police Minister Bheki Cele in May 2021, the SAP's budget expenditure in 2020-2021 was 99.6 billion rand, and the institution's budget would be an estimated 97.1 billion rand in 2021-2022. It's important to note that a decade ago, the SAP's budget stood at 55.6 billion rand in 2012, and therefore the current SAP's budget represents a 65.6% increase from 2012. This is one of the very few, public institutions that have seen such a large budget increase over the past decade. When tabling the budget in Parliament last year, the police minister said that the compensation of employees within SAPs accounted for 78% of the budget over the preceding 3-year period. With this sort of large and increased fiscal investment in policing over the past decade, we should see a positive relationship between crime rates and this budget allocation, right? In other words, because we've spent so much on policing and the police budget itself, the majority of which goes to police personnel salaries, we should see a similar decrease in crime levels. But unfortunately, this isn't the case. According to research and analysis by Lizette Lancaster at the Institute for Security Studies, the police's ability to solve murders has declined by 38% since 2011-2012, with the results that in 2019 and 2020, detectives were only able to solve and close 19 out of every 100 murder dockets opened with them. Again, that's an ability to solve just 19% of all murders. In the same year, the police were only able to solve 1/5 of the murders reported to them. There were 21,325 murders recorded in 2021. South Africa consistently records about 20,000 murders a year, and it is really terrifying to think that only about 1/5 of them are solved in any given year. Murder rates are an important indicator of crime levels across the board, as many policing and safety experts strongly agree that murder is the most reliable measure of crime rates, given that murders are often, if not always, reported to the police. This is not always true for a variety of other types of crime, particularly those cases involving gender-based violence and sexual assault. For perspective and context, in the case of aggrieved or aggravated robbery, also in 2019 and 2020, only 17% of those reported cases were solved. Another factor to put into this context is that other categories of violent crime have also increased in the decade between 2010 and 2020. For example, armed robberies increased by about 43% in the same time period. I could continue with similar comparisons of other categories of crime, but I think the point has been quite clearly made that there is no discernible relationship, never mind a positive relationship, between how much we invest and pour into the police budget every year and lower rates of crime in the country. Worse so, there's almost no relationship between the annual budget and the police service's ability to solve crimes and their overall performance. With this perspective on the overall funding and function of the police, I think it's also important to spend some time thinking about the inner workings of the police too. So let's start with the SAPS's ability to investigate cases of unlawful conduct, violence, brutality, and other instances of ill discipline within its ranks. According to Gareth Newham's research, who was also at the Institute for Security Studies, the police accountability watchdog known as the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, I'm going to call it IPID for short, that institution has only referred 16% of the 47,984 cases that were opened against police officers between 2012 and 2020 for disciplinary action. Of that small fraction of cases that were referred for disciplinary action, only 3.2% ended in disciplinary conviction, and only 0.4%, or 194 actual police officers over a decade, were dismissed as a result, again, from the 47,000 cases that were opened over the past decade with IPID. So think about that again. In the 8 years between 2012 and 2020, and of the 47,984 complaints against the police that run the gamut from unlawful arrests, complaints of sexual abuse, sexual harassment and sexual violence, cases of torture, coerced testimonies, corruption, and others, only 194 police officers were found guilty of the complaints against them and dismissed as a result. This is obviously a very clear sign of an institution that is internally incapable of holding its members and itself accountable. Furthermore, if we follow the investigative reporting work of Daniel Knutzer and an organization called Viewfinder Journalism, you'll find a mountain of investigations into the ways in which IPID has been systematically underfunded, under-resourced, and undermined in their mandated work of holding police officers to account. In a very short summary of that investigative work, Viewfinder has found that senior police officers routinely exploit legal and regulatory loopholes to protect their colleagues implicated in violent crimes, including assault, torture, shootings, rape, and unlawful killings. All of this testimony and all of this investigative work has also come out of the trial of 3 police officers who were accused of killing Nathaniel Julies, a 16-year-old boy in El Dorado Park in August 2020. This really puts into perspective just how often the police lie about their violence and brutality, and how often senior police officials and politicians are willing to help them. I really cannot recommend engaging with Viewfinder's work enough. As a society, we cannot and should not estimate just how much impunity the police believe that they can act with. And now, in perhaps the most searing indictment of the police's seeming inability to do very much to facilitate community safety, I think it's worth illustrating just how badly crime intelligence failed in the face of the July unrest last year that roiled KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. The Crime Intelligence Division within the SAPS has 8,000 personnel members and a budget of 4 billion rand annually. But in a Daily Maverick article written by journalist Marianne Tam in late July last year, the current head of the division, Lieutenant General Yolisa Magabodi, described the division as being penniless, and she accused Minister Bheki of refusing to sign off on an additional 500 million rand budget injection into the division which has been and was unable to provide accurate and timely intelligence ahead of the unrest. She said that this was because of years of looting and mismanagement, making it impossible for the division to serve its function in preventing major threats, and those then being similar to the unrest that we saw in those days. And if I haven't infuriated you enough by now with all of this talk about the Crime Intelligence Division and the fact and their seeming inability to have done anything proactive ahead of the July unrest, then also consider the fact that their budget increased by 113% between 2011 and 2012, as well as 2019 and 2020. That's again 113% increase to an annual budget of 4 billion rand and 8,000 staff. I really could go on until the end of this entire gathering today, talking about just how much of institutional backlog and stymie there is within the SAPS. And I could talk about the enormous, really, DNA backlog within the Forensic Laboratory Service, or the fact that Parliament, both the Department of Health and the police, were warned about this backlog back in 2011 already. But I think, again, that the point really has been made at this point. And to close off, and I think something that has become very timely over the last few months, is also to speak about how, as with everything else in our society, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the threats facing the police and the collapse of that institution even worse. Crime rates plummeted during the various lockdown levels we've been through over the past 2 years, particularly between April and August last year, but those dramatic decreases were also followed by very high increases in crimes since the end of last year. Essentially, this means that the very harsh restrictions on movement and economic activities had a significant impact on crime patterns and the activities and routines of organized crime networks. And therefore, we're now seeing a sort of increase or spike in the incidence of specific crimes, such as cash and transit heists, hijackings, and now, as we've seen, also mass shootings or mass killings. In many other ways, the pandemic has also made other types of crime worse. There is now a significant recorded increase in the work of extortion gangs operating in several cities and townships, as organized criminals turn their attention to local businesses to extort for protection fees instead of what would have been their usual targets, which were nightclubs or sex workers or trafficking in drugs or guns. If you haven't heard of the Boko Haram gang that is currently operating between parts of Cape Town and Pretoria, you should consider yourself lucky. To conclude this contribution, I could try to find some good news amongst the deluge of bad news that I've just presented, but in all honesty, there just isn't enough about the practice of policing that's going well right now, and certainly not within or around the country's national police institution. The only real upside is that there are good police officers who are trying to do good work. They are being failed by the institution just as badly as we are. And if we're going to work to fix the institution for any other reason, then we need to ensure real safety for the communities that need it most. Then we should also work to reverse the rot, to stop the collapse, and to eradicate the threats for those good police officers and the fact that they wake up every day to try and do a bit of good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. How can it be turned around?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think one of the sort of key points or axes for intervention definitely has to do within policing. You know, we've seen there's a new National Police Commissioner. His name is General Fani Masemola. And already within I think it's been about 3 to 4 months that he's been appointed, he's put forward 2, I think, really interesting plans and ideas for how to structurally try to address many of the issues I was just talking about. So the first is putting together an accountability plan, and that really starts to look at individual station level, the station leadership. You know, I could go into an entire different lecture really about the institutional culture within policing, but a big part of that and a big part of the reason why much of our policing fails is because they, you know, aren't particularly dedicated or people or leaders within police stations who aren't completely haggard by the institution or disillusioned, really, by the work that they do. So that accountability plan is meant to try and address that, and to really both rapidly deploy resources, but also to have station leadership, very importantly, be more proactive in stating what their station's needs are, as well as what the community's needs are. That's on the one hand. I think on the other hand, we're very lucky to now have a police commissioner, and I say that quite glibly, but it is quite serious. We're very lucky to have a police commissioner who's now interested in the operational capacity of the institution as opposed to the politics of the institution. That's something we've seen over and over again with national police commissioners, and remembering that Bheki Cele himself was a former national police commissioner. Many of them were very happy to be caught up in the politics of the day, and in feuds or swearing allegiance or loyalty to a particular politician or president. And Masimola at this point has definitely indicated that that's not his goal or the way that he operates or works. Masimola has also been a career police officer himself, which I think is incredibly helpful. And as I've illustrated, the SAPS is actually a very large bureaucracy. So you need to have somebody who's both technically minded and who has a very good grasp of both the culture and practices within the structure. So in saying all of that, I don't think that Masimola is going to be the silver bullet, that changes the institution completely. But it's good to have somebody at the very top of police leadership that's trying to do really good work. In the same breath, again, really good institutions that are trying to hold the police to account, such as Viewfinder, such as the Social Justice Coalition, such as SERI, as well, the Socioeconomic Rights Institution. There really are some good organizations out there that are doing good work, towards police reform and to holding the SAPS to its mandate of community safety. And I think that those institutions themselves are just as important as the work that Masimola and other leaders are trying to do within the police as well.
Yes, please.
Is there any plan to get police intelligence working properly? The failure of that was the big issue this time last year in KZN.
Yeah, I think that, broadly, we had what was an incredible shock to the system with July unrest. I think for a long time, there were a lot of people who sort of either expected that the police had their ducks in a row in terms of crime intelligence, or who really didn't understand just how much of the institution itself had also been eroded and really damaged by multiple years of state capture, in which particularly Jacob Zuma and his acolytes used these large budgets within the police and in other institutions as slush funds for many of their own nefarious purposes. I think particularly on the intelligence side, there's been a focus on both crime intelligence within the police as an institution, but also within the network of state intelligence agencies or apparatus. So as much as crime intelligence, again, I don't think we're going to know very many of those details. It is an opaque institution by its very nature. But I think within crime intelligence in the SAPS, there's certainly a plan to really turn that division around and to really make use of the 4 billion Rand budget and the 8,000 staff members that it has, or roughly 8,000 staff members that it has. It's also really important for that institution to work in much closer cooperation with military intelligence, as well as state security and state intelligence. We've also seen the appointment of a permanent sort of intelligence czar, I guess you could say, within the presidency, which I think is important. It's not unusual in other countries to have the intelligence apparatus be closely tied to the presidency itself. Certainly are looking at issues of national importance and of national security. And so in that sense, you have, I think, for once, real sort of coalescence of these various parts of intelligence coming together in an organized and structured way and reporting directly to the presidency and the president himself. What is always going to be, I think, worrying, particularly with the state of the ANC itself, is that everything that happened during the July unrest was because of internal ANC factions. Many of us who sort of read and write and research about the police talk about often really how much it is not just kind of external or even opposition politics that have had a really damaging effect on the SAPS, but it's been specifically ANC politics. And again, this idea that this one is a Zuma man, this one is a Ramaphosa man, this one is aligned to this particular leader within the ANC. And that's deeply problematic. Again, if you have good career cops such as Masemola and others within leadership who aren't interested in playing those politics, that's really a good sign. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those politics and those cleavages within the police are going to disappear overnight.
Ziyanda, in your book, you talked about the culture within the police force, but you also talked about the responsibility of the society and its relationship with the police force. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that, quite often we, as a society, really, I'm not saying that any particular person does it, but we sort of outsource many of our society's issues to the police. So there's this idea that we can, police our way out of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And actually, what that really comes down to is the fact that, the police working, the police working within a society that has a lot of those issues is only ever going to deal with, parts of, or only has the tools to deal with a lot of those issues in a particular way. So, you think about, again, this idea that the police or the military stepping into, sort of blitz this idea of, or the manifestation of gang violence out of the Cape Flats every few months. Of course, it's a short-sighted and ineffective strategy because of the fact that gangs and criminal networks really thrive in communities where there is social dysfunction. So these are communities that don't have economic opportunities for young people, and so they join gangs. These are, communities in which young people don't finish, school or education for various reasons. These are communities that are underserved and don't have access to good government services. And that's really when, gangsters and criminals step in and they offer, particularly young people, but others as well in the community, a kind of path or a kind of network to making some sort of money. And that really then, that we have to put the mirror back up for ourselves as a society and really ask, can all of those things be laid at the feet of the police alone? And can we expect them to solve all of those issues alone? I would obviously say that the answer is no, and that I think that we as a society shouldn't be, voting for or believing politicians who, sort of feed us this message of only I can solve the crime problem, or more police and more boots on the ground, without actually thinking about what do these communities need. And those are a variety of needs, really. Everything from good and basic government services and infrastructure being available to better schools and better resource schools as well. And ultimately also creating employment and economic opportunities for people. All of those are long-term solutions and fixes. And I think that as a society in South Africa, we've become incredibly impatient with very many of these, policy solutions or issues. But at the same time, we really need to understand that, our support of sending in the military over and over again, or giving more guns and more bullets to the police don't actually have a long-term solve. And at the end of the day, what it really does is, push us closer to a point where many of these communities, are in perpetual dysfunction.
Morning, Ziyanda. Thank you for an absolutely fascinating presentation. It's perhaps just a perception. I don't know what the actual research is. If we think back to 2010, when we hosted the World Cup, the country seemed peaceful at that time. When the expensive security guards made a mess of it, the police stepped in, and actually things went so well, and there was a feeling of national unity. That could just be our perception. What do the statistics say? Was there less crime during that period? What was magical about it? Was it because Sid Blatter was running the country? Or is it something that we can really take some hope from? That at that crucial period, our country worked quite well and the police seemed to be doing a superb job.
That's a really great question. And, South Africa, particularly being a country that has hosted a World Cup, isn't the only case in which, security apparatus, as well as the country, definitely benefited from a large boost in both, transport infrastructure, such as, the building of the My City buses in Cape Town, as well as the Gautrain in Joburg. I think really what you're picking up on and what you're highlighting is the fact that so much energy, infrastructure, resources, time, and money went into building a kind of almost functioning any sort of city economies and spaces, particularly to host the World Cup, but also for the large influx of tourists that we were expecting and then received. So really, in that sense, I think that much of what really works about World Cups, and this happened in Brazil as well, it's happened in other countries that have hosted them, particularly in the global south. What really works is that rapid investment in infrastructure, but also the fact that it brings economic opportunity and activity. It's people who are selling, whether it was the macarapas, the hats that people wear at games, whether it's selling vuvuzelas, whether it was them being able to start a tourism business. That's really the energy and the feeling that I think really came forward. And in many ways, like you say, that spurred a lot of national pride and kind of building and working together. I think a lot of that incredibly positive attitude was also there in the late 1990s, going into the early 2000s, when we did have really good economic growth as well, over about 4% over a period of a couple of years. What that does is that when the economy is growing, when people feel like there's an economic future for themselves, when they can imagine themselves working towards proactively lifting themselves out of working class or poor backgrounds, that's the type of positive energy that moves societies forward, where there is social mobility, where people can see economic activity leading to their circumstances being better. That's precisely the type of thing that really spurs, whether it's national pride, whether it's police officers being able to walk into their police stations any day, really, and feeling motivated to do their jobs. That's the type of energy that I think moves things forward. But for South Africa, and unfortunately over the past decade, and particularly with issues around state capture, that has really slowed down, as well as the fact that our economy hasn't been growing in multiple years now, particularly hard hit during COVID. I think that's the thing that's missing, the thing that was there during the World Cup, and the thing that's now missing, I think, from our society.
Ziyanda, you mentioned briefly the DNA forensic laboratories that are in a mess, but how can such an important facility be neglected over such a long period? And can't private sector laboratories that are so well equipped be used to help alleviate that situation?
That's an excellent question. And I think that I mentioned in the sort of piece or the talk earlier, this was something that was a long time coming, where, again, Parliament had called in, two parliamentary committees had called in both the leadership of the Department of Health as well as the SAPS, and warned them that there was a growing backlog of DNA samples, and it was negatively and has very negatively affected the effective prosecution of a lot of different cases. I think that is a particularly, it's not unique, but it's a particularly sort of extreme example of where two departments couldn't be bothered to communicate with each other and take responsibility for which of those services or which department is meant to lead those services. At one point, the Department of Health was almost entirely responsible for the forensic lab services, even though they fell under the SAPS. And that administration moved more and more over towards the responsibility of the SAPS. And that's really when the cracks started to form. And very importantly, there were about 150, as of last year, about 150 very important vacancies that hadn't been filled within the laboratory service, which meant that samples weren't being properly monitored or catalogued or processed in time before they deteriorated. I would agree with you that, at least as a temporary measure, there should be some at this point, contracting of private labs, especially those that were able to do quite good work during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to very quickly process samples there, that there could be a sort of public-private partnership that works there. But, you know, on a Zoom call like this with you and I, that definitely seems like a solution. But we're unfortunately not in police leadership where we're able to make decisions like that. And again, to really prevent a situation where people try to blame each other for what has happened instead of trying to solve the issue at hand.
There is a question from the audience of the relationship between the police force and the judiciary. Can you elaborate on that, please?
So I think the really tough thing at the end of the day is that it's really, really difficult to build a good case and even to put together, you know, a cogent docket for prosecution if the police themselves haven't handled cases very well. There's meant to be continuous training and refresher training for police officers on how to handle, you know, evidence and how to try and catalog evidence, which makes a really sort of coherent set of documents or pieces for prosecutors when they are meant to take cases for prosecution. But a lot of that has really fallen to the wayside. I think we've seen it a lot in a lot of recent high-profile cases, such as that of Senzo Mayiwa, you know, the Shrin Devani botched prosecution, and others as well. And really what that means is that there is a breakdown between what is meant to be presented in dockets and cases that the NPA takes forward. I don't think that it's necessarily because of any bad relations or any bad blood between any parts of the NPA and the police service itself. It's because of the quality of police work having deteriorated over time. There are low conviction rates that the NPA has struggled with over multiple years. It also has its own internal issues, very much along the lines of retaining prosecutors, being able to train new as well, and the function of the judiciary and the court service itself. I think that we're sort of working with two institutions that are, I don't necessarily want to say struggling, but that are not performing optimally. And then you have a situation where you're meant to bring them together. And that's definitely isn't working. There are definitely frictions between the two institutions that impede the way that they can work. There is meant to be, again, really good relationships and relationship buildings. And they typically are at the local level between local prosecutors and police officers themselves. But I think as a whole, because both institutions are not working at their best, really, you then have a situation where either is really putting their best foot forward.
How can the police force improve the relationship with society?
Yeah, also a really, really great question. So in writing my book, I reread Johnny Steinberg's really great book from the early 2000s. I think it was published in 2009, called Thin Blue. And he does a really great job of following a couple of different police officers on their patrols and in their work over a couple of weeks in Johannesburg. And he really makes such a great observation when he says that the police and many of the particularly poor and working class communities that they work in are like an unhappy family. They're constantly meeting in very unhappy circumstances, and neither is able to help the other, really, particularly the police themselves. And I think what that really speaks to is the fact that quite often, again, in many of these poor and working class communities, the police are only ever there to disperse service delivery protest, or they're there to do the absolute bare minimum and really can't deal with many of the issues that manifest in those communities over and over again. And as I was saying earlier, that's not necessarily their fault in and of itself or in isolation. But I think that in trying to build trust with communities, the police should be seen as being an active part of any community. They're not just there in times of crisis, but they should be trying to build good networks with church organizations, for example, or with youth organizations that work in many of these communities. And we should start to see them be actively involved as members of these communities, because the police themselves are also recruited from these communities. It's very rare to find them parachuted in from elsewhere. And what that means, I think, practically, is something that former Lieutenant General Jeremy Vieri has spoken about before, where he says that in very many communities, including Guguletu, where my family's from and where I've grown up as well, is the fact that there are, regular sort of, whether it's markets or community fairs, that are meant to try and crowd out and push out this idea that, only criminals live here or that streets are unsafe. Those type of events and those type of community gatherings are meant to happen to really try and promote foot traffic and to eliminate areas of communities where people feel that they are inherently unsafe. What makes a part of a community unsafe, or what makes a community unsafe, is when people are not, walking the streets, when they're not claiming public space. And the point that Jeremy Vieri tries to make is that the police themselves could be proactively involved in those type of settings. And again, in meeting and speaking to, ordinary community members long before they, arrive onto a scene with tear gas and with rubber bullets, or when they're there to, with the laboratory services to collect a corpse. So this idea that you can build community trust is actually inherent in very much of the activities that communities themselves take on. But for various reasons, the police have seen themselves as separate to those activities and to that work, where they really should be deeply involved in much of what the community is proactively doing and what they're positively doing, as opposed to kind of being this outside or even occupying force.
About 10 years ago, there was an initiative in Khayelitsha to create safe corridors. Do you know what happened to this initiative?
That's a great question. I think that, initiatives like that also came out of the Khayelitsha Commission, for example, and work being done there to really try and pinpoint and address issues that came out of both that investigation and the testimony of many community members of their the treatment that they've received at the hands of the SAPS. Initiatives like that sometimes are not just at the behest of just the SAPS or community members. They're also meant to involve, local government structures. They're meant to involve national government structures, such as the Department of Transport, for example. And I think that that's the type of relationship that sometimes gets strained when, again, political interference starts to seep in. If you have a local ward councillor who isn't interested in initiatives such as that, or that initiative wasn't their idea and they're uninterested in carrying it forward or even taking it forward, that's when they really start to come apart at the seams. I don't know in the particular case of Khayelitsha, but in multiple other initiatives, what does sometimes happen is this idea that this is something only for elections or only for vote getting, not really looking at it as a sustainable and proactive intervention. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. We definitely should. It just means that I think people have to be kind of wise to who gets involved in those initiatives and who puts their hands up sometimes to lead them.
In the last couple of days, the police has been very busy arresting Samas that have been roaming the area for years in Krugersdorp after the horrendous attack on the young girls there. Do you think it's just a public relations exercise, or do they have the right culprits?
So I do speak about in the book a couple of different examples of where there is a kind of performative or even sort of pantomiming of police performance, typically, long after something has happened, and again, typically when something as horrific as what happened in Krugersdorp takes place. I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, in that if the police were able to arrest, I think it's over 80 individuals, many of them being, identified as Basotho nationals, and as well as those who are involved in illegal mining, these sort of Zama groups. it's very, very possible that this isn't the first time that something has happened with a group like this. Likely not at this scale, but certainly, not the first time that these groups have done something illegal or perpetrated a heinous crime of this nature. I think, again, so much of our policing is reactive, and so much of it is the police coming from a position of being on the back foot, and especially with Bekicele, who absolutely loves flying into a situation, seeming to take control and then leaving without having instituted anything sort of sustainable or long-term. I think that as long as that continues and that keeps happening, unfortunately, incidents such as the Krugersdorp mass rape are not as uncommon as one would like to think. I think in this case, again, the media attention is helpful and it's useful, and it really spurs that particular local police station into action, and I think particularly into enforcing immigration laws and proactively policing the area. But it shouldn't have come to that. It really shouldn't have come to a situation where the mass rape of multiple women had to occur in order for the police to really do their jobs.
Any more questions?
What about your ideas about decentralizing the police force to the provinces and not having, a national police force?
I mean, I think that there are always going to be, benefits and downsides to the idea of decentralization. I do think that the SAPS at this point is overly centralized and overly reliant on, again, a very large bureaucracy that's typically based in Pretoria, and many sort of national decisions coming down from Pretoria that make it so that the sort of practice of policing is the same across the country, when we know that our communities are so diverse, and even the provinces themselves have different needs and different priorities when it comes to trying to tackle crime and violent crime itself. I think at the end of the day, the idea of decentralization is there, and there are mechanisms within both the South African Police Service Act as well as the Constitution to devolve some function and some responsibility to the provinces. If we had, I think, a police minister that was more interested in the policy work of policing and not just sort of the publicity or performative parts of his job, then I think we could get to a point where it would make a lot of sense, and where this sort of decentralization or devolution of duties could be done in a structured and organized way. I think until we have that, we'll more likely have a situation where it's more politics that drives the idea of decentralization, as it does in the Western Cape and in Cape Town, than necessarily a kind of organized framework for how to decentralize some functions of the police. But I'm definitely not opposed to the idea that more could be done to decentralize the police service itself, and in many ways that could help with the function of the police service, both on a provincial level, but also at the more micro and station level.
Was our current Minister of Police, Bekicele, really a good police commissioner or not?
Quite plainly, no. Again, I think that Zile is a lifelong politician, very effective politician in KZN. If you sort of believe what many have said, I think he was, at the time that he was least commissioner, I would have been in my early 20s. But even at that point, people had very fervently said that he's not the right man for the job. Again, the work of, or what is meant to be the work of the National Police Commissioner is very micro level. It's meant to be granular, it's technocratic, it's bureaucratic, again, trying to lead a very large organization. And the work of police minister is meant to be a lot more in terms of policy and coordinating at the national cabinet level what are crime prevention strategies strategies. And honestly, Bheki isn't good at either of those things. He's just not. He's a politician. He's somebody who can work a crowd and can rally political support, but he really is just not good at either of the functions of National Police Commissioner or Police Minister. I've said multiple times, if he was reshuffled or we got rid of him, it wouldn't solve all of our problems. But I'm definitely starting to believe that it wouldn't be a bad thing to remove him as police minister.
The theft of copper wire and metal, scrap metal, seems to be a huge problem, particularly for the railways, and also I now notice that Eskom are complaining about it as well. What is done about checking up on scrap metal buyers? Because if you don't have a market, the crime will stop. I don't see any in the press or news items, I don't see any evidence of investigation of scrap buyers or arrests and shutting down on scrap metal buyers. Do you have a comment on that?
That's a really good point, and it's definitely something in other panel discussions that I've been part of. It's absolutely a worry of business lobbies, whether it pertains to Eskom or whether it pertains to the breakdown of rail infrastructure as well, which is obviously driven up the price of or meant that suppliers have to use the road infrastructure, which is a lot more expensive and not necessarily always as reliable as being able to move things by rail. I can't really speak to what is and isn't out there in the media about this in particular, or strategies that may be sort of put forward. But it absolutely is a priority of sort of large business lobbies across the country, that there should be both a focus on scrap metal buyers that are driving this market and that are paying for stolen cable and even stolen rail infrastructure. I don't know much more, unfortunately, in terms of details of that, but I agree with you that your instinct is correct, that if you shut down the market that exists for it, that it then squeezes those actors in that system who are buying that stolen scrap metal.
There was a picture, I think, in this morning's newspaper about the police confiscating 2.5 million rand worth of copper cable in Brackenfell. And when you saw it, it was the big reels that the copper cables come off.
That sounds like it was acquired from the supplier direct, unused.
Yeah. It fell off the truck.
It hasn't been stolen from the user.
No, it was stolen from the user.
From the user.
It was stolen from Eskom. No, it was stolen from Eskom.
Okay. Thank you.
I think to add to that as a final point, I'd sort of mentioned it earlier in the talk as well, that because there's been such a, again, level of dysfunction and lack of proactive policing, very many different types of crime, we have seen really a rapid rise in organized crime and syndicates that are popping up in different sort of parts of the economy and driving types of crime that include, mass copper theft, extortion rings as well. Many of these shootings that are being reported as shootings in taverns, but really what they are is that they're actually extortion gangs targeting small businesses. Those small businesses happen to be taverns right now, but during the pandemic, there were multiple shootings across Cape Town as well that were targeting spaza shops, as well as spaza shop owners. So you really have organized crime and syndicates that are operating really with impunity and targeting various types of small businesses and saying to them, if you want to operate in this area, or if you want to do business in this area, you have to pay us money. Otherwise, we'll make sure that your business is targeted itself. And given that some of these shootings were perpetrated, by gunmen who had AK-47s, we're not America. High caliber firearms like that are not easy to find on the street. And so that really, again, points to the fact that there is organization and there's coordination between these gangs and these groups, whether it's, again, ranges from stealing large amounts of copper to targeting small businesses.
Thank you very much, Ziyanda. Thank you very much for your time and for a fantastic hour of your talk. Goodbye.
Absolutely.